to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with the drum. Say, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time. Why don't you remember, I'm your pal. Say, buddy, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, ah, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with a drum. Oh, say, don't you remember, they called me Al. It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember, I'm your pal. Buddy, can you spare a dime?
Hi guys, we're going to go ahead and start this week's video, continuing our exploration into the information for period 7. We'll wrap this up in the next week with this video and the next video, and then we'll be ready to take the period 7 test. You'll notice throughout this video that I am in a slightly different location this week, which I know very few people probably would notice or care about. But you know, it's a different, slightly different setting. There are sometimes questions. So, in case you, Hyatt, have any questions about what's behind me, I'll go ahead and let you know. I just have my map up here, and not my typical, you know, Martin Luther King post. So, it should be pretty fine. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started with this week's information. Hopefully, it'll be painless, but let's get right to it. So again, we are talking about the Great Depression, and we are looking at this week's information and discussing kind of that transition from the 1920s with the basically the affluence and the prosperity that we saw from the literature in the 20s, but also from just the culture and what we know about social culture in the 1920s to the Depression, both somewhat physically, mentally, and also, of course, in terms of the economy. So we're going to talk about this change from that 20s policies, politically speaking, to the 30s, but also from that affluence and prosperity to the downfall of the economy in the 1930s. So let's go ahead and get started. You've seen the causes of the Great Depression. You worked on those in class. So you've seen those causes of the Great Depression. So that's something that you can kind of look more into and explore on your own. But there were some immediate effects of the Great Depression as well. During the fall of the stock market in 1929 and the crash of the stock market, we start to see banks failing as well. By 1932, 5,761 banks had failed, which was 22% of the total. The 4,000 of those collapsed between 1932 of December 1932, and the new president's inauguration in March of 1933. So a lot of times we say, it started in 1929, but it's an understanding. There's a strong understanding that there are 3 to 4 years where it is progressively getting worse. And so we see that with that time period, which is actually the lame duck session for Hoover going into the new president in 1933, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But thousands of businesses failed. 20,000 in 1929, 30,000 in 1932. Business investment between 1929 and 1932 decreased by nearly 95%. 95%. I don't need to tell you that is a massive decrease for business investment, but it just goes to show how important security in the stock market, security in the economy is. Nobody wants to invest, even if you have the money to do it. Nobody wants to invest in a system that's consistently failing, where their money is not safe or in any way guaranteed to be there. Or be a wise investment. So down by 95%. Unemployment reached 25% by 1932, and that's not including farmers. That's 13 million people. The unemployment rate got as high as 33% when you include farmers, and 50% in Chicago alone. So these are huge numbers. I always try to put this in perspective because we just went through a really large and troubling recession in 2008. And at the height, we talked about unemployment a lot. At the height, the unemployment during the Great Recession was about 12%. Here in Tennessee, maybe closer to 15%. But the unemployment rate in places like Chicago during the Depression was 50% and 33% when you include farmers. So that's a huge, huge downgrade in the quality of life and in the security of people to find quality jobs. Low-skilled workers were most affected. Professionals in the middle class suffered less. They were coming off of a time, again, prosperity, where everybody pretty much had a job. Unemployment was almost at full employment at 3.2% in 1929, and the auto industry only functioned at about 20% of capacity by 1932, whereas the steel industry was only at 12% of capacity. Ideally saying that with larger companies, this is going to grow the economy, and there's going to be even more jobs available. So people really saw this outlook, this good thing that's coming, and then we see the major crash in 1929. Not only that, wages were dropping from $12 billion to $7 billion from 1929 to 1932. This is about 41%. 41% in wages dropping in 3 years. So we've seen wages stagnate over the last 40 years, but we haven't seen, not only have we not really seen a drop, we certainly haven't seen a decrease of 2/5, or, that's a huge amount of to drop in wages over that time period. Now, part of that is deflation. So basically, part of it is just that the value of the money that they're making is going down, and so that's going to make that number come out a little bit differently. But a lot of it is really that a lot of people are just making less money. Businesses can't afford to pay any more wages, and so that's going to lead us to an increase in child labor, which is going to occur. By 1932, 25% of farmers had lost their farms. And whenever you are thinking about the statistics of the Great Depression, you need to think about, how did this affect farmers? Because farmers then and now were and are some of the most important people in the economy, if not the most important at different times, because of what they provide for the country. And so when we see that farms are suffering, which they were suffering before the Great Depression, when they see they're suffering at that rate, we know that we can see that effect kind of trickle throughout the economy. A major cause of this was a large drop in food prices caused by overproduction and less demand from Europe. And that has a lot to do with the decline in decline in demand for food after World War I. Farmers had increased what they were putting out for World War I, and after World War I was over, they didn't need to do as much. So because of that, they wanted to make more money, and one of the things they would do is attempt to make more product, because when you make more, you have more to sell, and you're going to make more money. But what that does is it drives up the supply, which is going to drive down the price if the demand is going to stay the same. So this was a huge issue, and that overproduction and lower demand is really going to drastically drop the prices, and that's going to cause a lot of farmers not to be able to keep up with their money. There's also a human cost to all of this. There's a human cost beyond just the economy. And of course, all of that dealt with humans. But we're looking at people experiencing a loss of self-worth, families breaking up, marriage and rate birth also decline. Marriage and birth rate, also declined. And families doubled up in houses and apartments. 3 million people became hobos and lived in makeshift shacks known as Hoovervilles. Of course, with an attempt or a thought of blaming the then president, Herbert Hoover, for what was a perceived lack of interest or ability to stop the decline. Malnutrition was rampant in certain areas, but death by starvation was uncommon. So that didn't happen a whole lot. We didn't quite get to that level here. Nevertheless, malnutrition did cause people to be more susceptible to fatal diseases, which is going to spread rampantly, especially in these overcrowded cities during the Great Depression. So, under Hoover's administration, there's often a misconception, I guess, that Hoover sometimes was indifferent to the plight of people and didn't really do anything or try to do anything to stop the Great Depression. And that's not really true. I don't think he was necessarily well equipped to deal with it, and I certainly don't think that he was he did probably what was best, and I know that he didn't brand it in the right way, or he didn't explain himself in the right way. So, but he certainly didn't have anything. I don't think he, disliked certain people or whatever, but he did do a couple of things, especially including the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. Now, this is the highest peacetime tariff in the nation's history. It is going to raise the average duty from 38.5%, which was under the Fortney-Macomber Tariff of 1922, to nearly 60%. That is a huge increase in the tariff, and the reason that is because it is they want more people to buy American goods, and if you make the cost of foreign goods higher, then people are going to turn to American goods. That's the thought. But what it actually did was exacerbate the existing international economic depression, which foreign countries interpreted as an economic declaration of war, and a lot of them stopped trading with us, and the volume of trade shrunk. International financial chaos resulted in the U.S. becoming even more isolationist, especially economically speaking. And so what it actually does, instead of making people turn to American goods, it actually makes goods here less available and ends up hurting the consumer a lot more than helping businesses, which was its intent. He also did do a couple of things with public works. In 1930, Congress appropriated $750 million for public buildings, river and harbor improvements, the highway construction, all to stimulate employment. Also, the Boulder Dam started its construction in 1931 and was completed by 1936, later, of course, called the Hoover Dam. Construction of the dam employed thousands and created a huge man-made lake for irrigation, flood control, and electric power. And by 1932, the efforts of the president and Congress had yielded very little economic growth. So there were those attempts, but they weren't overly successful. To make matters worse, I guess is the way to put it, we have 14,000 unemployed veterans from World War I primarily who marched on Washington in the summer of 1932 to lobby Congress for payment of bonuses that were payable in 1945. This was a promise. Basically, they said if you serve in the military, it wasn't a full-time job then like it is now. There weren't benefits or anything for World War I, but they said if you do this, then we will pay you a bonus in 1945. And because because of that, they realized they needed it now during the Depression. They had been forgotten, and they became known as the Forgotten Man or the Forgotten Generation. And so because of that, they ended up marching on Washington to demand that bonus in 1932. Hoover insisted that the Senate not pass the bill, and they didn't. And they instead offered congressional transportation back to their homes, which many of the bonus army accepted. However, 5,000 of them decided to stay, in large part because they didn't have anywhere to go, so they decided to stay along the Anacostia River and continue to lobby for their cause. Hoover called in the army to remove the bonus army. So he called in our military to remove the bonus army, and under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur, a name you will hear many, many times, I assure you, under the direction of General Douglas MacArthur and his basically assistant or right-hand man, Dwight David Eisenhower, not a general at the time, but again, you'll hear him later. They ended up moving in, called in the army to remove the bonus army, because 2 veterans were killed in a clash with the police. They actually went in, they tear gassed the camp. The camps were burned, their belongings were burned. There was a small child killed in the kind of commotion, I guess, if you will. And what it does is it shows that Hoover appears heartless. Again, it's a very bad thing to have in 1932 in the middle of a presidential election. And so it's going to hurt Hoover's image. And what was already hurt and what was already a bad image of Hoover is going to get so much worse that there's very little chance for him to succeed in the future. Which brings us to the 1932 election. First of all, let's talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was born at his family home in Hyde Park, New York, and raised in a wealthy family. He served as Undersecretary of the Navy during World War I. He worked toward increasing U.S. naval strength. He was the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats in 1920 when James Cotts lost the election to Warren Harding in a landslide. He, in 1921, contracted polio and ended up confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Although he could do a very modest form of walking, he was mostly confined to a wheelchair for the rest of the time he was alive. He was elected governor of New York in 1928 and again in 1930. His Depression-era programs for the unemployed, public works, aid to farmers, and conservation attracted national attention. Rich people often dubbed him traitor to his class due to these relief programs. And he spoke frequently of his concern for the plight of the forgotten man mentioned earlier. He was a master politician who was willing to compromise, and today we would likely label him a moderate. He was perhaps the premier orator of his generation, and you'll get a chance to read through some of his works as we continue to go forward. And you already have in some cases. He had some conservative tendencies, fiscal frugality, and not anti-big business. But his struggle with polio was able to strengthen his will, his patience, his tolerance, and his compassion. So he became sort of an interesting hodgepodge of a politician, and we see what some people would call a socialist, some people would call a liberal, some people call a conservative. And so he was all over the place, but he's going to be sort of an interesting politician. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt and distant cousin of FDR. As a, I guess, early fun fact for today, Eleanor Roosevelt's maiden name was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was, again, actually Roosevelt before she met FDR, because they're related, but distantly, so it's legal. She pushed FDR to maintain his political career after he contracted polio and vigorously campaigned on his behalf during the 1920s. She was a major figure of the female wing of the Democratic Party in the 1920s and early 30s. Basically, she's going to become what some people call the conscience of the New Deal, because she published a syndicated newspaper column, My Day, and this weekly, and lobbied extensively for her husband, and she championed causes for women, children, the poor, and African Americans. essentially, she is going to be the most active first lady in American history, at least up until that time, and she is going to be basically create what a modern first lady is. It's not just soft causes that first ladies often take up, but true policies and working with the big boys, if you will, which we'll talk about in just a second. Roosevelt, FDR, was nominated as the Democratic candidate, and he was chosen over Al Smith, who had lost the election to Hoover in 1928, and is famous in New York, Al Smith dinner, things like that. Roosevelt said, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people. His positions were somewhat vague and contradictory during the campaign. He promised a balanced budget and 25% cuts in government spending. He criticized present budget deficits. He promised government aid for the unemployed, and he advocated the repeal of prohibition. Herbert Hoover was renominated as Republican candidate. His platform included higher tariffs and maintenance of the gold standard. He believed a repeal of the Hawley-Smoot tariff would be economically devastating. He reaffirmed his faith in American free enterprise and individual initiative, and his defensive tone contrasted with Roosevelt's optimism. In the election of 1932, we're going to see a landslide. Roosevelt's going to win, I believe it was 479 electoral votes, something like that, so make check my math. Hoover's only going to take 6 states. So you can see here with this electoral map that it is just basically an obliteration of his opponent. And he won very handily, 1932, in the first of his election wins. So we can see that, again, with this electoral map. So in the period between one president and the next, we call the lame duck president. He doesn't have any large power or initiative or any kind of mandate. He's just basically waiting to be taken out. But it is very active for some incoming presidents. In this case, the 20th Amendment first was passed. It was ratified in January 1933. Presidential, vice presidential, congressional terms would henceforth begin in January instead of March. It was clear that the lame duck period was too long because they saw what was happening during a serious crisis like the Depression. And FDR was the first president to begin a new presidential term on January 20th in 1937 when he was reelected to his second term. The 21st Amendment was passed by Congress in February of 1933. It repealed prohibition. In March, the new Congress legalized light beer. The amendment was ratified by the states and took effect in December of 1933. The New Deal. In FDR's inaugural address, he made one of his most famous quotes that whether you are aware it's him or not, you know the quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He said, let me reaffirm my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he was basically talking about, again, that kind of vague optimism that he used so much to get people on his side. And he worked hard behind the scenes to work out all of the details. But to the people, he was always this beacon of kind of hope and honor and all of these different things. So because of that, people kind of got on his side, whether they knew what he was doing or not, which they really didn't. But the Roosevelt administration included a brain trust. FDR selected experts for his inner circle rather than the typical politician or businessman. Notable cabinet members and advisors of FDR's inner circle includes Harry Hopkins, the head of the FERA and later the WPA, which you can look up. Some of those, we'll talk about those in just a minute. Frances Perkins, who was the first female cabinet member. She was the Secretary of Labor. Harold L. Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, headed the PWA as well. Cordell Hull, Secretary of State from Pickett County, Tennessee. He was the longest, almost said reigning, the longest serving Secretary of State in history. Served for, I believe, 16 years. But again, somebody can check me on that. I'm not 100% sure. And he was, and also there was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was so powerful within this administration. She was actually one of the 5 people that were just, right around Roosevelt and kind of really in there making the decision. So again, very important to him and to the country and to her position. Then we have the first 100 days, March 9th to June 16th, 1933. FDR did not have a developed plan when he took office. He intended to experiment and find out what worked, and as a result, many programs overlapped and contradicted others. He sought practical solutions to problems. He often used fireside chats or radio addresses to communicate effectively with the American people. So he is going to do some things a little bit differently, and he is going to pass more legislation in his first 100 days than some presidents do, period. And so it's kind of a very busy time period, but FDR gets right to work and again does things that people don't necessarily agree with, but they may not know because he never really said this is what we're doing. He just said trust me, basically, and the people kind of did because of the way that he spoke. These are the 3 R's. A little hard to see, I realize now, but these are the 3 R's of the New Deal. And we're just going to look at this. Relief, recovery, and reform. These are the 3 aspects of relief, recovery, reform. I didn't make this little thing here, but I'll explain it the best I can. Basically, you want to think of relief as a bowl of fruit or a bowl of food that provides temporary relief to people out of work. Think of it as handouts. Think of it as bread lines, bread kitchens, soup kitchens, whatever. These are places where you can go and get immediate help and immediate aid. A lot of times when people think of the New Deal and when they think of what some people incorrectly, I think, call entitlement programs today, I think this is what they think of. This is just giving people something so that they can move on, get what they need right now, and basically try to get instant relief in the short term. Recovery are things we see here in the middle, NRA and the AAA. We often call his programs the alphabet soup of the New Deal. But the NRA, National Relief Administration, I believe, no, National Recovery Administration, were things that were basically, that was the thing that held everything together. It did things on its own, but not in the way that say the WPA or the CCC or any of those do. And then we have reform. These are long-term foundational programs that are going to play a permanent role in the U.S. economy. And these types of things are the basically, these are the programs that are going to stick around. The Social Security Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. I do this all the time. And SEC. And then you've got things that change, things like the Indian Reorganization Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. But all of these are intended to change the economy and change the government so that none of these types of things happen again. So these are the 3 basic portions of the New Deal. And these are the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, reform. Not everything that FDR did was popular. He is going to attempt to do several things that are going to be stricken down by the Supreme Court. And so a lot of people are going to see some of those things. I mean, they're big programs for him that he really wanted to pass. And because of that, he's going to try to pass the Judiciary Reorganization Bill. And it's also called the Judicial Procedures Reform Act. In 1937, what he wanted to do was be able to remove old conservative justices by imposing a retirement requirement for justices 70 years or older. 6 justices were over the age of 70 at the time, so that would give him the ability to replace 6 justices. The law said if a justice refused to step down, the president could appoint an additional justice. Had the bill passed, FDR could have immediately appointed 6 new justices, bringing the court's total to 15. Critics accused FDR of being a dictator and trying to pack the court with liberals, or what we call court packing. FDR was accused of tampering with the delicate checks and balances in the Constitution. He thus lost some support from conservatives in his own party. The bill was soundly rejected by Congress. Interestingly, the court began siding with New Deal programs on later court decisions. And minimum wages for women, the Wagner Act, and the Social Security Act were all upheld. Chief Justice Earl Evans Hughes and Justice Owen Roberts began to vote with more liberal members of the court. And ironically, even though he attempted to do this and failed, FDR ended up making 9 appointments to the court due to resignations or deaths of justices and because he was president forever. So he ended up with a lot of sway and power over the Supreme Court. All right, so the end of the New Deal. Recession of 1937 and 1938. FDR authorized a reduction and relief programs in early 1937. He had always had a goal to balance the federal budget and get away from deficit spending. He believed the economy was in recovery and no longer needed as much federal government intervention. By 1938, the country had slipped into a deep recession, wiping out most of the gains since 1933. Direct aid relief programs, especially the WPA, Works Progress Administration, were resumed, and the economy began to improve in 1938. FDR employed the economic theories of John Maynard Keynes, who, of course, was the creator of Keynesian economics, who argued government shouldn't resort to deficit spending in order to prime the pump of the economy, but that the government would make up the money when the economy improved through increased tax revenue. And he basically Keynes believed in government manipulation of the economy through a national central bank that would basically change the circumstances for people to borrow money, and that would in turn create money and investment, also known as the way we do things in this country now. So one of those things that he's very influential. But these programs end up seeking to provide temporary relief to people in need and were to be disbanded when the economy improved. All right. So that's the end of this week's video, and we are going to close with this week's fun fact. In 1937, at the peak of Franklin D. Roosevelt's big government New Deal era, federal government spending accounted for 11% of GDP. In 1983, at the peak of Ronald Reagan's small government conservative era, federal government spending accounted for 24% of GDP. Really puts things into perspective. All right, so thank you for joining me this week. I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video. I hope that you will get the information that you need to out of it, and I hope that this is something that you feel is at least in some part worth your time, and if not, oh well, do it anyway. Thank you again for watching. I will see you in class, and have a great day and a great week.